When people think of medieval convents, they often imagine hushed halls, the soft shuffle of sandaled feet, and the low hum of morning chants drifting through ancient stone. In paintings, the women wore flowing habits, their faces serene and untroubled, eyes lifted to heaven. But this is the version history books wanted us to see, a version scrubbed clean by centuries of religious storytelling. The truth? The truth was far more human, more passionate, and in many ways far more dangerous. Because inside those convent walls, amid candlelight and prayer, something bold and quietly rebellious was happening. These convents, carved into hillsides and nestled behind thick monastery walls, were not just houses of God. They were shelters from the world, sanctuaries from marriage, hideaways from men who saw women as property. They were, for many women, the only place on earth where they could breathe without permission, where they could write without censorship, where they could feel, really feel, for the first time in their lives. And what they felt wasn't always devotion to the divine. Often it was love. Not the spiritual kind, but the kind that keeps you up at night. The kind that makes your hands tremble when hers brushes yours in the candlelit hall. Picture a girl named Elisenda. She was 12 when her father decided she would marry the blacksmith. 40 years her senior, his hands blistered, his breath sour with ale. Instead, her aunt, a nun at St. Agnes of Verona, convinced her father to donate the girl to the convent. He agreed, mostly for the tax relief. Elisenda arrived wrapped in linen, holding a small satchel and trembling with a fear she couldn't name. But the moment the heavy gate creaked shut behind her, something strange happened. She exhaled, not in panic, in relief. At first, she expected cruelty, punishment, silence. But what she found were women, fierce, intelligent, witty women, running their own world behind those stone walls. They brewed their own medicine. They copied books in 3 languages. They wrote poetry. They debated philosophy. And yes, they laughed. Loudly. And often. One of the first women she met was Sister Beata, who winked at her during choir practice and later slipped her a note beneath her psalter. "Smile, little bird," it read. "No man owns you here." That sentence would haunt and nourish Elisenda for years. No man owns you here. It was the quiet mantra of the convents. It wasn't written on banners. It didn't need to be. It was stitched into the rhythm of the place. This was freedom, not complete, not without risk, but freedom nonetheless. And with freedom came something rare, the ability to choose whom you loved. But the convents were not just homes to free-spirited women. They were also cages. Every joy was shadowed by rules, every liberty balanced by surveillance. And yet these women, these brilliant, restless women, found ways to live beyond those boundaries. Not loudly, not defiantly, but quietly, with a kind of radical subtlety. A look across the cloister garden. A note slipped between loaves of bread. A brush of fingers during evening prayers. These were not accidental gestures. They were sacred communications. Each convent was different, of course. Some were strict, others lenient. But all were built on one idea: submission. Submission to God. Submission to silence. Submission to obedience. But how do you silence women who have tasted knowledge? Who have read the Psalms in Latin and memorized the Song of Songs? You don't. Not entirely. Not forever. You force them to whisper. And whisper they did. In many convents, love between women was an open secret. It didn't wear a name, because names meant danger. But it lived in shared blankets. In prayers recited a beat too slowly. In the bruises left by missed goodbyes and the elation of stolen moments together in the library at dawn. Nuns who loved each other did not shout. They sang. They wove meaning into embroidery, into the colors of candles, into the very way they knelt beside each other at vespers. There's a story passed down about 2 nuns in a convent near Toulouse. Sister Aude and Sister Claire. One was a scribe, the other a gardener. Their love unfolded not in kisses, but in the slow rhythm of daily life. A shared orange at breakfast. A prayer whispered into the other's ear at night. One day Claire fell ill. Aude wrote her daily letters, folded into petals and tucked into the herb satchels hung beside her bed. "My love," one read, "your silence deafens the chapel." Claire never recovered. But before she died, she asked Aude to bury her with the letters. The abbess allowed it, perhaps pretending she didn't know what they were. Why didn't the church stop this? The truth is, it tried. But for every rule written to suppress these relationships, a new form of rebellion blossomed. You see, the convent was a paradox. It was created to contain women. But it also educated them. gave them the tools of language, gave them time to reflect, gave them community. These weren't peasant girls anymore. They were scholars, poets, thinkers. And love, especially forbidden love, has always thrived in the minds of the intelligent. Let us not forget, the church itself relied on these women. They were its scribes, its healers, its guardians of relics and scripture. Punish them too harshly, and you risked losing not just souls, but power, records, entire communities. So a silent bargain formed. Turn a blind eye, as long as the veil of purity remained. But even veils have edges, and the edges fray. The church began calling these relationships particular friendships. A euphemism, a warning. Manuals were written to train abbesses how to detect them. If two women spent too much time alone, if they defended each other too often, if one wept when the other was punished, it was noted. And punished. Not always violently. But separation was common. Transfers. Assignments. Forced silence. But none of it stopped love. In fact, it only made it more careful. More creative. Nuns developed coded language. Shared books with underlined verses. Invented saints whose feast days aligned with secret anniversaries. In one convent, women arranged stones in the garden to form initials visible only from the tower. These were not flings. They were commitments. Private marriages, hidden from the world, but held as sacred as any sacrament. And yes, some of these relationships were physical. But to reduce them to sex is to miss the point. These were women seeking solace in each other's arms because the world had told them they were nothing without a man. And here, behind stone and scripture, they found something no man could give them: recognition, safety, partnership, the ability to be fully themselves without apology. This wasn't just about rebellion. It was about survival, about making meaning in a world that erased them. And in that, they were revolutionaries. Quiet ones, yes, but revolutionaries all the same. Because what could be more radical in the 12th century than two women loving each other freely? Of course, not every story ended in peace. Some were caught, some punished, some even killed, but many endured. Their letters, hidden in monastery basements, in coded margin notes, in dusty archives, still speak. You can read their words today. Some sound like scripture, others like poetry, all of them like love. And what makes this so powerful isn't just the courage these women showed. It's the quiet defiance. They didn't march. They didn't protest. They loved. Carefully. Passionately. Desperately. And in doing so, they cracked the very foundation of the society meant to control them. So the next time you picture a convent, picture this: a woman standing in a chapel at dusk. Candles flicker. She's alone, or so it seems. But she's not praying to heaven. She's waiting. Listening. Because tonight, like so many nights before, love will arrive in silence. And they will talk not with words, but with hands, with glances, with breath. The world outside may never know their names. But behind those ancient walls, their hearts carved a history no church could bury. The story of the convent begins long before the gates close. It begins in the drawing rooms of old stone manors, where fathers whisper to other men over tankards of ale. It begins at dinner tables where young girls sit silent while their futures are decided for them. It begins with the sound of a mother's quiet sob when a betrothal is announced. Not for love, not for partnership, but for land, for name, for alliances between men. In medieval Europe, a girl was rarely her own. From the moment she was born, she belonged to someone: her father, her brother, her husband-to-be. She was a piece on a chessboard, moved not by her own desires, but by the ambitions of men. Her smile was currency. Her body, a bargaining chip. Her future, a transaction waiting to be signed. Imagine being 13 and knowing that your life was already written. That by 16, you would be wed to a man you barely knew. That by 20, you'd likely be bearing your third child, or buried with the second. Love was not part of the equation. Choice wasn't either. But there was one loophole. A hidden path carved through centuries of patriarchy. The convent. To the outside world, joining a convent was a holy act. A sacrifice. A girl called by God. But inside family circles, it was often the lesser evil. Especially for daughters deemed too headstrong, or too plain, or simply too inconvenient. Some girls were sent to convents because there wasn't enough dowry for marriage. Others, because their fathers feared the dishonor of an independent daughter. Yet others chose it, voluntarily and often in desperation, because it was the only way out. One such girl was Marietta. She was promised to a merchant in his 50s when she was barely 14. He had a paunch, a temper, and 3 sons from his last wife. Marietta, soft-spoken but brilliant, begged her mother for an escape. Her mother, once forced into her own loveless union, wept silently and sent for her brother, the local abbot. Within days, Marietta's fate changed. Her dowry redirected. Her hair sheared. She entered the convent of Saint Celeste not in chains, but in relief. The first time she slept alone in a room without fear of a man entering, she cried. Not from sorrow, from liberation. That's the part history rarely tells. That for many women, the convent was not confinement, it was refuge. A place where the rules were harsh, yes, but consistent. Predictable. And most importantly, devoid of male control. No leering glances. No swollen knuckles. No midnight summons to a marriage bed. And within those walls, something happened that no one anticipated. These women began to bloom. They learned to read, often for the first time. They studied scripture and medicine, astronomy and agriculture. They ran vineyards, managed finances, treated illnesses. Some wrote books, books that survived when the names of queens did not. In a society that gave women no voice, the convent gave them a pen. But it wasn't just knowledge they found. It was sisterhood. And from sisterhood came intimacy. You see, most of these women had never been allowed true friendship. Their lives before the convent had been transactional, competitive, shadowed by fear. But in the convent, they lived side by side, year after year. They shared chores, secrets, stories whispered in the candlelight. And inevitably, some of these bonds became more than friendship. Historians often debate whether these were romantic or spiritual relationships. But ask any woman who's ever loved another in secret. Sometimes it's both. The line blurs, and the world stops caring about definitions. What mattered was the connection, the tenderness, the touch of a hand that said, I see you. I choose you. You are mine and I am yours. These weren't rebellious girls trying to scandalize the church. These were survivors of a world that gave them no sanctuary except each other. And make no mistake, men knew it. The church was not ignorant of these relationships. It feared them, not because they threatened doctrine, but because they threatened control. A woman who needed no man was dangerous. A woman who loved another woman? Revolutionary. So the church pushed back. Investigations began. Convents were raided. Friendships scrutinized. Love letters burned. But for every fire they started, another candle was lit in the dark. Because you can't erase a truth once it's spoken, especially when it's whispered in the language of longing. Some convents became known for their liberal communities, places where women could live in relative emotional freedom, under abbesses who protected their own. These leaders weren't fools. They understood the politics of power. They knew that as long as they kept donations flowing and scandals quiet, Rome would turn a blind eye. And behind those guarded doors, women created a world all their own. In one convent, they developed rituals, blessings for birthdays, feast day dances, shared fasts for those in pain. One nun, Sister Honora, composed songs for her beloved using only psalms and hymn melodies. Another, Sister Celeste, grew an herb garden shaped like her lover's initials, visible only from the bell tower. Some nuns even wore rings, simple bands forged from convent silver, exchanged in ceremonies held at midnight by candlelight. They took vows, not of holy orders, but of fidelity, compassion, and shared life. It is easy to romanticize, but these stories were not without cost. Many paid dearly. When discovered, some were separated permanently. Others were imprisoned, their writings confiscated and destroyed. A few were even excommunicated. But still the stories endured. Passed down not in books, but in songs, gestures, oral histories whispered from one novitiate to another. And for every punishment, a dozen more women stepped into that void, choosing the convent not as a last resort, but as a first act of defiance. A refusal to be traded like livestock. A choice to live, even if only partially free. Imagine how radical that was in a world where women were forbidden to choose anything. You may ask, were all women in convents queer? No, of course not. But many carried some part of the outsider within them, whether in their desires, their minds, or their unwillingness to be defined by a husband's surname. Some were thinkers, others healers. Some were devout, others quietly skeptical. But all shared one trait. They dared to imagine a life different than the one assigned to them. And that makes them heroes. Not warriors with swords, but with ink and silence and stubborn hope. With tenderness shared behind closed doors. with poems that risked damnation, with hands held under the table during prayer. In the convent, they carved a sanctuary from a society that gave them none. And in that sanctuary, they found not only survival, but meaning. Today, many of their names are lost, their graves marked only by crumbling stone. But if you walk the cloisters of any ancient abbey, listen closely. You'll hear it in the wind through the arches, in the echoes of chant still trapped in the bricks, in the spaces between silence. 1,000 whispers, all saying the same thing. We were here. We loved. We chose each other. And though the world forgot us, we lived on our own terms. That in itself was a miracle. We often imagine the medieval convent as a place untouched by earthly desires, an island of purity floating above the sinful world. The nuns inside are thought of as devout, chaste, immune to the chaos of human emotion. But that's a myth, a story told by those who feared what really happened behind those high stone walls. Because the truth is far more human, far more vulnerable, and far more honest. Romantic and even sexual relationships between nuns were not rare mistakes. They were quietly woven into the fabric of convent life. They didn't happen once in a while. They happened often. Not in every convent, but in many. And not just occasionally, but throughout generations. They were not flukes. They were not strange deviations. They were patterns, unspoken, unrecorded in official histories, but alive in hidden letters, in the private rituals, in the way women looked at one another when no one else dared to see. To understand this, you have to understand the world these women lived in. The medieval world was not kind to love that defied structure. A woman's body, her choices, even her emotions, belonged to someone else, a father, a husband, a church. But the convent was different. It was built to control women, yes, but it also separated them from male control. And when women live together, serve together, and are isolated from men for life, deep emotional bonds inevitably form. Let's not romanticize this too quickly. These were not utopias. The church's presence was everywhere. Rules were strict. Surveillance was real. But so was desire. So was loneliness. And so was longing, for touch, for understanding, for closeness that couldn't be found in the cold stone silence of prayer alone. Imagine living your entire life surrounded only by women. Waking up beside the same face every morning, praying side by side, tending the gardens, cleaning, cooking, studying, sharing every aspect of daily life. For many nuns, especially those who entered as children, their entire experience of adulthood was shaped by the presence of other women. Some fell into love slowly, not even recognizing it for what it was. A lingering look, a shared smile, a hand held a little too long during confession. Others knew immediately, drawn like magnets to one another, despite the fear, despite the warnings, despite the risk. And yes, some of these relationships were physical. This part makes many people uncomfortable. Even now, as if imagining two nuns kissing under candlelight is somehow more scandalous than the hypocrisy of the institutions that tried to erase them. But the truth remains. Countless historical documents, buried in church records, uncovered in trial transcripts, hidden in ancient letters, reveal that many of these relationships included physical intimacy. Inquisition files describe them. Love letters detail them in coded language. Confessions, often obtained under torture, spill them in heart-wrenching fragments. These are not just isolated moments of passion. They were part of full, long-lasting relationships. Some women were lovers for decades. And they weren't hiding in shame. They hid for safety. There's a difference. In many convents, these relationships were semi-tolerated, as long as they weren't public. Abbesses looked the other way. Confessors urged discretion but stopped short of reporting. Everyone understood the price of losing the most capable, intelligent women in the community. If a nun brought in a large dowry, her sins were often forgiven faster. And if she helped manage the finances, translate scripture, or maintain peace, well, silence became convenient. There's one particularly haunting story from a convent in Florence, where two nuns, Agnes and Livia, shared a cell for 15 years. They were never formally accused of anything. But when Livia fell gravely ill, she asked to be buried with Agnes's prayer book. The abbess allowed it. After Livia's death, Agnes never spoke again. She fasted until her body gave out. They died 1 year apart, buried side by side under an altar that still bears their initials carved into the stone. Of course, not every love story ended in sorrow. Some were quiet triumphs. In one convent in Spain, a scribe named Sister Isabel wrote illuminated manuscripts filled with vivid images. Two women embracing under a tree, a pair of doves tied by a red ribbon, initials entwined in gold leaf. The censors let them pass, believing them to be metaphors. But in her private journal, hidden in a false bottom of a wooden chest, Isabel wrote, "Every word I write is for her. Every letter a touch. Every gold line her name." Sometimes, love found its voice in music. Nuns composed hymns to one another, disguising them as songs to the Virgin Mary. In the gentle rise and fall of chant, in the hidden harmonies, their longings spilled like incense into the air. There was also playfulness. Secret kisses in the kitchens. Flirtations exchanged in Latin. Pet names passed in code. Gifts, small, simple things, carved buttons, strands of hair braided into ribbons, poems pressed between pages of scripture. And always risk. The church knew. It feared the power of women who needed no man. Manuals were written to detect particular friendships. Nuns were warned to avoid excessive closeness. But how do you legislate the heart? How do you police a stolen glance, or a letter written in the middle of the night? You don't. You try. You fail. You burn one letter, but 3 more are written. You punish one woman, and 10 more learn to hide better. You try to silence love, and you only teach it to speak in whispers that echo louder than screams. Even trials, meant to shame and destroy, often revealed the opposite. One Inquisition document recounts the interrogation of a nun named Caterina, accused of unnatural affection for another sister. Under pressure, she confessed, "Yes, I loved her. Yes, we lay together. And if I am condemned for that, so be it. I would rather burn than pretend her love was anything but holy." She was silenced, but her words survived. Many of these women were not simply indulging desires. They were creating something sacred in defiance of a world that called their love a sin. They were building sanctuaries within sanctuaries. Hidden worlds where love was not a curse, but a blessing. Where they could be seen, understood, cherished. And those relationships mattered, not just to them, but to history. Because these were not fleeting moments. These were entire lives shaped by devotion, not just to God, but to each other. And while the church spent centuries trying to erase them, they left traces in stone, in song, in ink, and in memory. What makes their love so powerful is not just its beauty, but its resistance. It bloomed in the dark, among rules and punishments, nourished by courage and silence. It was both a shelter and a protest, a kiss and a revolution. And the more you dig, the more you realize, these stories weren't rare. They were everywhere, waiting, whispering, enduring. So when someone tells you that nun-on-nun love was unusual, remind them, that's not what the history says. That's not what the letters say. That's not what the women themselves said. Their love was real, common, and unforgettable. And maybe, just maybe, it's time we stop treating it like a secret. There's a certain kind of genius that blooms under pressure. A creativity born not from comfort, but from restriction. When you cannot speak freely, you find new ways to be heard. And inside the stone walls of medieval convents, where silence, obedience, and chastity were demanded, women found a language that both shielded and revealed the truth of their hearts. They used the very tools of the church, the scripture, the liturgy, the hymns, to speak about love. But not just divine love. Romantic love. Forbidden love. Love for each other. These weren't careless whispers. These were coded messages, so brilliant, so subtle, that they still echo today in the margins of prayer books, in the footnotes of sermons, in the verses of songs meant for heaven but aimed at another human soul. To survive, they learned to speak in metaphor, to hide emotion behind incense and allegory. Their love letters didn't begin with "my dearest" or "my darling." They began with "my soul thirsts for thee," or "you are my chosen vessel." On the surface, these were devotional phrases. But behind them, layered in context and tone, lay the unmistakable heartbeat of longing. Take the phrase, "Bride of Christ." It was meant to describe a nun's total dedication to Jesus. But in the hands of women who loved women, it became something more. It became a way to legitimize passion, to frame their connection as holy, unassailable, beyond reproach. And so, one nun might write to another, "You, my sister, are as Christ to me, and I, his bride, offer myself through you." To a priest reading it, nothing seemed amiss. To the woman receiving it, it was everything. This use of spiritual language as camouflage wasn't accidental. It was strategic. The church had made the rules. So the women used those very rules as a shield. They knew the Psalms, the Gospels, the mystics. They were educated, far more than most women of their time. They'd read Teresa of Avila, Bernard of Clairvaux, the Song of Songs. And they knew how to wield those words like a blade wrapped in velvet. The Song of Songs was a favorite. That book of the Bible, already unusually sensual, offered a treasure chest of metaphors. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. My beloved is mine, and I am his. Your love is better than wine. These lines, written centuries before, became the script for countless hidden courtships. But in the convents, the he often became a she. Silently, boldly. In one preserved letter from a 14th century convent, a nun wrote, "When I kneel in chapel, and your voice lifts the hymn, it is as if God himself enters me." The censors read it as mysticism. The recipient knew better. She knew what it meant to be pierced not just by sound, but by presence. To feel another's spirit move through you like breath through prayer. There was a rhythm to these letters. A poetry. They spoke of divine unions and sacred touch, of holy longing and blessed closeness. In isolation, they might be dismissed as theological musings. But strung together across pages and years, they form a tapestry of undeniable love. And this language wasn't just in letters. It bled into sermons, into songs, into stained glass. A nun composing a hymn might describe the beloved's eyes like the morning star, or the warmth of a hand in the darkness. In a sermon, she might compare the closeness of sisters to the closeness of angels. In a painting, she might place two figures side by side, their halos tilted toward each other, their hands nearly touching. A gesture that to the untrained eye was piety, but to those who knew intimacy. They even encoded love into the structure of prayers. In one convent, a group of women developed a system where the positioning of their hands during rosary recitation conveyed hidden meaning. A folded thumb signaled sorrow, a raised pinky devotion. Together, these gestures became a private language, spoken only in sacred spaces, understood only by the ones who knew. Why go to such lengths? Because silence was dangerous. And so was honesty. A woman who openly declared her love risked everything, her reputation, her role, her life. But metaphor? Metaphor was safe. It was invisible armor. It allowed her to say everything while appearing to say nothing. But make no mistake, the emotions were real. The desire was real. The risk was real. There's a haunting confession from a nun named Beatrice, discovered in an Inquisition record. She said, "They think I worship the Virgin, but it is Sister Maria whose voice brings me to tears. When she reads the Magnificat, I feel it not in my ears but in my skin." The inquisitor asked if this was lust. She said, "No. It is reverence. It is love. And if that is a sin, I cannot repent it." She was sentenced to solitary penance for 10 years. But her words, her metaphor, survived. And isn't that the miracle? That so many of these words survived? We find them today in dusty archives, in the margins of devotionals, in half-erased ink beneath layers of theological commentary. You have to squint. You have to know what you're looking for. But when you do, the entire world of these women unfolds like a secret song. They weren't just hiding. They were weaving, crafting, encoding. They were turning the tools of oppression into instruments of expression. They were using the church's language to build something the church could not see, much less destroy. Some wrote full treatises on love, using divine imagery to describe relationships that were clearly human. Others wrote poems disguised as prayers, addressed not to God, but to a beloved sister. One such poem begins, "In your shadow I rest, O radiant flame, whose light blinds me in blessedness." That's not theology. That's yearning. That's poetry born from hunger. And what makes it even more astonishing is that it worked. For centuries, the very power structure that tried to crush their love became the shelter beneath which it survived. And that, in itself, is a kind of holy brilliance. Imagine the courage it took to love with that much clarity in a world that only offered condemnation. Imagine the intellect it required to translate that love into a code so elegant, it passed as piety. Imagine the pain of loving someone so openly in private and so secretly in public. But also imagine the beauty, the intimacy of knowing someone's soul so well, you could speak to her in riddles and she would still understand. The joy of receiving a letter filled with scripture and knowing every verse was a mirror of her love. The thrill of standing side by side in prayer, reciting the same psalm, and knowing that the words were yours alone. This was not fantasy. It was faith transformed. It was passion repurposed. It was love, resilient and reverent. And though the world may have forgotten their names, their language still lives. In the pages of history, in the poetry of the sacred, in the way we still long to speak what cannot be spoken. These women were not saints in the way the Church defines saints, but they were holy in the truest sense of the word. Whole, brave, devoted. They didn't just use metaphor. They became metaphor, living symbols of love that refuses to be silenced. So the next time you hear a hymn or read a line of scripture that speaks of divine longing, ask yourself, who is it really written for? Because in every line of sacred text, there may lie a secret, a love letter, a vow, a kiss hidden in verse, a whisper wrapped in prayer. In a world that denied them nearly everything, freedom, desire, even identity, some women dared to reach for the one thing no one could take, the right to love. Not in the open, not with the blessing of priests or the approval of men, but in secret. Quietly, boldly, within convent walls thick with incense and tradition, they created their own kind of holy union. They didn't call them weddings. The word would have drawn too much fire. But they were weddings in every way that mattered. They exchanged rings. They made vows. They celebrated anniversaries marked by the stars, not the calendar. They bound their lives together with the solemnity the Church reserved only for man and wife. Except, in these cases, it was woman to woman, nun to nun, heart to heart. It often began with a look, a series of stolen glances across the cloister courtyard, a shared song that turned into private conversation, a partnership on daily chores that soon became an excuse just to be near each other. And then one night, maybe after evening prayer, in the hush of candlelight, one of them would take a risk. She'd reach for the other's hand. Hold it. Let it linger just a moment too long. If the other didn't pull away, it would begin. But this wasn't about sudden passion. It was about slow, deliberate commitment. These were women who had spent their lives hidden behind veils, told to suppress every earthly emotion. When they fell in love, it wasn't casual. It was consuming. It wasn't just desire, it was devotion. And so they made it sacred. In one convent in France, the archives tell of Sister Leonide and Sister Heloise, who conducted a private ceremony beneath the convent's ancient olive tree. They had chosen the spot carefully, far from the cloisters, hidden by a curtain of vines. There, beneath the stars, they stood barefoot in the grass, hands clasped. They read from the Book of Ruth. "Whither thou goest, I will go." A passage about loyalty. But between them, it was a vow. Heloise offered a simple band, forged from a spoon smuggled from the kitchen. Leonide pressed a ribbon of her own hair into Heloise's palm. No priest officiated. No witnesses stood by. But in that moment, they were married, in spirit, in choice, in the silence of the night. This wasn't rare. Across Europe, in Spain, in Italy, in the Low Countries, nuns crafted their own unions. Some were as simple as exchanging tokens, a painted stone, a silver thread, a pressed flower passed between pages of a psalter. Others were elaborate, mirroring the wedding rites they saw in noble households. Handwritten vows, symbolic gestures, songs composed for one another and sung in whispered Latin during moments of solitude. One convent preserved a diary, its pages filled with entries like, "Today marks our 5th year. My heart still leaps at her footsteps, and we shared bread at sunrise as we did that morning, in our place, in our vow." Their rings weren't gold. Their vows weren't registered. But they were no less binding. In fact, they may have been stronger. Because these women had no illusions. They knew the cost. They knew discovery could mean separation, punishment, disgrace. And still they vowed. Still they promised. Still they chose love over fear. Some carved dates into the backs of crucifixes. Others etched initials onto the inside covers of communal prayer books. Every act, no matter how small, was a declaration. We are each other's. They used the tools available, religious symbols, verses from scripture, objects from their daily routines, and repurposed them. A rosary bead became a ring. A candle shared at midnight became a pledge. The daily blessing at matins became a ritual reworded in secret to include one another. Even the language of theology was turned into private liturgy. Instead of "till death do us part," they'd whisper, "until heaven frees us." Instead of "I take thee," they'd murmur, "I have known you, and I am yours." One nun, writing in a journal now held in a Roman archive, described her secret vow like this. "We knelt before no man, but before each other. She touched my lips and said, 'This heart is yours to keep.' I answered not with words, but with a kiss. And so began our sacrament. There's power in ritual. The Church knew it. That's why it guarded marriage so fiercely. But these women took that same power and made it their own. They didn't need permission to make their love sacred. They already knew it was. In one tragic case, a nun named Serafina was caught after years of private devotion to another sister. When interrogated, she refused to recant. "We married in the eyes of God," she said. "And if that condemns me, then let me burn as his bride." She was silenced. Her partner transferred to another convent. But her words, recorded by the very men who sought to shame her, still live. These unions were not illusions. They were deeply felt, carefully crafted acts of commitment. And though they were never recognized by the church, they were treated by the women as holy. That matters. That changes how we tell their story. It wasn't just rebellion. It wasn't just desire. It was love. Love made ritual. Love made vow. Love made real. Even today, scholars are still uncovering fragments of these private ceremonies. Letters between abbesses and bishops that vaguely refer to undue affection, or ceremonies of troubling intimacy. Marginal notes in missals describing unusual rites performed under moonlight. Artifacts, twin rings found hidden beneath floorboards, matching crosses buried side by side in old graves. The evidence is scattered, fragmented, but it's there, and it tells one story over and over again. These women did not just fall in love. They chose it, honored it, promised themselves to it. Their vows were not legal but spiritual, not public but eternal. And perhaps in that secrecy, their love became even more profound. Because it had to be forged in fire. It had to endure in silence. It had to live without applause or recognition. It had to be enough for them, and for no one else. And isn't that the purest kind of commitment? Two souls choosing each other, knowing the world will never celebrate it. Two hearts making a home in the only place they could, in each other. They wore no white. They heard no bells. They signed no registers. But they made promises that rang louder than any cathedral choir. And those promises, written not in ink but in courage, still echo today. So when we look back at these women, let us not pity them for what they lacked. Let us honor them for what they created. A ceremony of their own. A language of their own. A sacred love that no church could define, no priest could bless, and no punishment could undo. They made love holy, not by asking for permission, but by daring to believe it always was. For centuries, the Catholic Church prided itself on its power to control. Empires, kings, knowledge, the very fate of souls. But there was one force it could never fully tame. One rebellion it didn't anticipate. It wasn't a war or a political movement. It was love. Quiet, intimate, and happening under its very roof. In the cloistered halls of medieval convents, love between women, often subtle, sometimes sensual, always dangerous, began to bloom. And while the world outside assumed these nuns lived lives of silence and chastity, the church began to panic. Because it wasn't just a few isolated incidents. It was a pattern, a hidden culture, a threat not to theology, but to control. So the church did what it always did when faced with something it feared. It institutionalized the response. They called it corruptio monialium, corruption of nuns. Manuals were written. Secret investigations launched. Whisper networks of clergy and informants deployed. The same church that canonized saints and blessed kings was now interrogating sisters who held hands too long or wept when separated. One such manual, discovered in the Vatican archives, outlined how to spot particular friendships. It warned of excessive physical closeness, emotional dependency, and private meetings beyond the communal hours. A checklist, a surveillance guide, cloaked in pious language but rooted in fear. Abbesses were instructed to report any sisters who spent too much time alone together, who defended each other, who showed favoritism. Priests were told to probe for confessions during spiritual direction. Even the layout of convent cells was redesigned in some places. Walls thickened, windows made smaller, doors barred from the outside. The church wanted to see everything, to hear everything, but it still wasn't enough. So they went further, into the realm of the body. Medieval medicine, heavily influenced by church doctrine, was used as a weapon. Physicians claimed that lesbian attraction was the result of physical imbalances. Too much masculine heat, a wandering womb, or demonic possession. And these diagnoses justified brutal treatments. One recorded case from 1482 describes a nun who was tied down while the humors were drawn from her body through repeated bloodletting. Another was subjected to forced fasting, sleep deprivation, and cold baths, intended to cleanse her of lustful thoughts. A third was made to confess daily in front of the entire convent, shamed publicly with ashes on her head and a chain around her waist. And then there were the so-called tests. Inquisition documents reveal horrifying rituals disguised as spiritual or medical examination. Some nuns were physically inspected for signs of deviance, bruises, marks, even unnatural swelling. Others were interrogated under threat of excommunication or eternal damnation. A few were tortured, softly at first, through isolation and starvation. Later, through physical pain. The church never called it torture. They called it correction, discipline, healing. But we know what it was: cruelty wrapped in robes. And the worst part, many women broke. They recanted, not because they stopped loving, but because they couldn't endure the punishment. The guilt, the terror of seeing their beloved transferred, beaten, or erased. One nun, Sister Benvenuta, after weeks of confinement, confessed that her heart had strayed from Christ. Her words were written by the priest, not her. Her lover, Sister Pia, was moved to another convent hundreds of miles away. They never saw each other again. Benvenuta stopped speaking altogether. She died within the year. The convent record notes, she passed in silence, having found her way back to obedience. But we know better. That silence wasn't peace. It was grief. Still, not all bent under pressure. Some women stood their ground, at great cost. In Spain, a nun named Clara refused to deny her relationship with Sister Lucia. "If love is what condemns me," she said before the tribunal, "then Christ himself is guilty." She was branded a heretic, paraded through the town, locked in a stone cell for the remainder of her life. Yet her letters to Lucia survived, smuggled out in the binding of books carried by merchants, hidden in jars of preserved herbs. And in those pages, Clara never once asked for forgiveness. Only remembrance. You see, the church didn't just fear sin. It feared disorder. Women loving each other bypassed the entire system. No father negotiating a marriage. No man receiving a dowry. No children born to serve the church or crown. These relationships were invisible to patriarchal order. And that made them dangerous. So they had to be labeled as illness, or witchcraft, or seduction. But they were none of those things. They were love. Pure. Complicated. Real. And even in the face of punishment, the women found ways to resist. They created new codes. They trained each other in silence. Older nuns taught novitiates how to avoid surveillance, how to disguise letters as theological notes, how to use the language of saints to speak of devotion, how to meet in shadowed corners between bells. One convent, under constant investigation, rewrote its daily schedule to include extra prayer sessions. These were cover for secret meetings, brief, precious moments when lovers could be alone. In another, a group of sisters faked a quarrel to distract an investigator while their friends hid a pile of incriminating letters in the laundry oven. This was resistance. Not loud, not violent, but clever, steadfast, holy in its own quiet way. And sometimes even clergy helped. There were confessors who, behind the curtain, simply said, "Love is not the worst sin." There were bishops who turned a blind eye to friendship rings, exchanged at feast days. There were abbesses who moved two women into the same cell and marked it penance, when they knew it was sanctuary. These were the cracks in the system, the slivers of mercy that let some love survive. But not all were so lucky. Inquisition records from the 1500s list dozens of particular friendship trials. Some ended in exile, some in forced labor, a few in death. The church tried to write those women out of history. But they left traces we can still find if we look closely. A broken ring buried beneath a chapel. A letter folded into the spine of a prayer book. A name scratched into the base of a pew. Initials carved together into a tree in the convent garden. Two graves side by side, their dates matching, their stones unmarked. The church had its manuals, its rules, its punishments. But love had memory, and memory lives on. So what do we do with this history? Do we flinch? Turn away? Pretend it never happened? Or do we honor it? Do we name the injustice and also the bravery? Do we remember the women who kissed behind walls built to divide them? Do we carry their story, not as scandal, but as sacred truth? Because here's what the manuals never understood. You can torture the body. You can silence the tongue. But you cannot unwrite love. You cannot erase what was real. You cannot unvow what two hearts promised in secret. And in the end, even the church, with all its power and paper, could not win. Because we are still telling their stories, still speaking their names, still listening for the echo of love in every cloistered hall. They tried everything. They rewrote the rules, strengthened the gates, turned confessionals into interrogation rooms. They punished affection, redefined love as sin, declared longing to be weakness. And still it wasn't enough, because behind every rule stood a woman with a heart. And that heart, no matter how silenced, how punished, remembered how to feel, how to hope, how to resist. Not with swords or speeches, but with glances, with gestures, with a breath held too long, a hymn sung too slowly, a word written slightly slanted in the corner of a parchment. This is how they survived, not in open rebellion, but in the sacred art of subtlety. When love was forbidden, they made it invisible. When voices were silenced, they taught each other to speak without sound. And that's what makes their resistance extraordinary. Because it was quiet, because it was dangerous, and because it never stopped. After the church declared particular friendships sinful, punishable, even heretical, most thought it would end there. That women would learn to behave. That fear would crush their affection. But they misunderstood the strength of a heart that has tasted freedom. Love didn't die. It went underground. Women began to communicate in signals so gentle they could be mistaken for routine. A hand placed on a shoulder twice during evening prayer meant, "I miss you." A candle moved from one side of the altar to the other said, "Meet me." 3 taps against a wooden bench meant, "I am with you even now." They developed what scholars now call emotional codes. Tiny systems of connection woven into the rhythms of convent life. Unnoticed by most. Sacred to those who knew. One convent in the north of France used embroidery as language. Sisters stitched patterns into altar cloths, delicate loops and knots that represented feelings. A tulip shape for affection. A broken vine for sorrow. 2 interlocking circles meant, "I remember our promise." And if you think this sounds too delicate to be defiant, remember this. They risked everything to stitch those threads. A single mistake, a single interpretation by the wrong set of eyes, and they could be punished. Isolated. Transferred. Worse. But they did it anyway. Because love has always been braver than fear. Some women trained their bodies to deliver messages during Mass. A half-turn of the wrist. A delayed kneel. A finger brushing against the hem of another's robe. It was choreography graceful, practiced, holy. Their own secret ballet of rebellion. In one story passed down through oral tradition, 2 nuns, Letitia and Marta, were forbidden to speak after a letter between them was intercepted. The abbess demanded silence. Total separation. But every night at Vespers, Letitia would cough once, then twice. A signal. And Marta would sing a single note, just slightly out of tune, so that Letitia would know she had heard. That was all. Just sound. 2 tiny moments. But it was enough to keep them sane. Enough to keep them connected. Enough to say, "I'm still here." Others used scent, rubbing rosemary into sleeves to signal remembrance, or tucking sprigs of lavender into beds as a message of care. They used candles, burning them for half the usual time as a symbol of waiting. They wrote verses from scripture but changed a word or two, shifting the meaning, turning sacred text into hidden vows. Resistance, in this form, was almost invisible. But it was everywhere. And it had to be. Because the walls were listening. The priests were watching. The punishments were real. But so was the love. And it grew stronger in silence. These weren't foolish girls unaware of risk. These were brilliant, educated women who knew how to manipulate systems. How to bend rules without breaking them. How to dress truth in the clothes of obedience. In one preserved manuscript, a nun writes, "I have made a home of silence. My hands speak where my lips cannot. And every quiet act I give her is louder than any hymn I could sing." That's not fear. That's power. And for some, these codes became lifelines, threads they clung to through years of forced separation, through illness, even through death. In a convent in the Italian countryside, a young novice named Filomena fell in love with Sister Cecilia. When their closeness was discovered, Cecilia was reassigned. Filomena was forbidden to speak to her. But on the day Cecilia left, Filomena placed a single stone beside the chapel door. Every morning after that, she replaced it with another. A silent count. 1 stone for each day apart. She did this for 2,093 days. And on the day Cecilia returned, older, weary, unsure, she found a pile of 2,093 stones waiting for her. That was the message. That was the code. That was the vow. I waited. Can you imagine the strength? The discipline? The love it took to do that? The church wanted these women to forget. to bury their affection beneath ritual and shame. But instead, they turned that same ritual into memory, into presence, into persistence. Even in grief, they found ways to honor love. When a beloved sister died, some nuns wove her hair into bracelets. Others copied her favorite psalms and hid them in the spines of books. Some marked her grave with symbols: 2 birds, 1 tree, a cluster of stars, codes understood only by the one left behind. They created languages so personal, so intimate, that no priest could ever translate them. And this wasn't just about love between women. It was about reclaiming ownership of feeling in a world that told them emotion was dangerous. They weren't just resisting persecution. They were preserving connection, identity, dignity, and they did it with astonishing ingenuity. Today, we know only fragments of these codes. A line in a journal, a symbol on a page, a letter with edges burned away. But even those fragments tell us something profound. These women refused to disappear. They refused to let their love be erased by doctrine or fear. They kept it alive in the smallest, bravest ways imaginable. A touch, a scent, a rhythm of steps in a hallway, a candle lit on the wrong side of the altar, a word misspelled on purpose, a heartbeat communicated through pattern and pause. Every act was an offering, a message, a protest. Every act was an answer to the question, how do you love in a world built to stop you? And their answer was clear. You love anyway. You love in silence. You love in code. You love so fiercely that even when your voice is taken, your message still sings. So yes, the church tried to crush them. Yes, they created manuals and punishments and walls. But the women whispered anyway. And that whisper became legend. Because when love has no voice, it learns to speak in flame. And when a heart is forbidden, it learns to beat louder in the dark. Her name was Bernardetta Carlini, and to the world she was a mystic, a visionary, a woman chosen by heaven. She claimed to speak with angels, to be guided by divine voices, to experience ecstasies so powerful they left her trembling on the chapel floor. But beneath the layers of incense and ritual, Bernardetta carried a secret. A love, not for God, or not only for God, but for another woman, another nun. And in a world where such a thing could cost you your name, your freedom, even your life, Bernardetta didn't just hide it. She justified it. She claimed it was sanctified. She said the love between her and Sister Bartolomea was not sinful. It was sacred, ordained by heaven, approved by angels, blessed by the divine, ***. It was one of the boldest acts of spiritual defiance in the entire history of the Church, and it shook the cloisters of Italy to their core. Bernardetta Carlini wasn't born into privilege. She wasn't a noble's daughter or a scholar's child, but she was gifted, brilliant, intense, charismatic. She entered the convent of Pescia in the early 1600s, a time of harsh inquisition, a time when the Church wielded fear like a sword. From the beginning, she stood out. She fasted to extremes. She claimed to receive visions, angels, saints, even the Virgin herself. The sisters feared her, admired her. Some doubted her. Others followed her. And then came Bartolomea. Gentle, thoughtful, curious, a newcomer to the convent. She and Bernardetta were assigned to the same dormitory, the same duties. They grew close, and then closer, until one night, something happened that would change everything. Bernardetta claimed she had been possessed by an angel, that this angel had taken over her body. And through this divine presence, the angel had loved Bartolomea. Not in metaphor, not in spirit, in flesh. Bernardetta didn't say, "I love her." She said, "He loves her through me." A scandal? Absolutely. But here's the part that shook the Church. Some believed her. In those years, mystics were both feared and revered. They were seen as conduits for the divine, especially women. Their ecstasies, their visions, their wounds, these were often interpreted as signs of closeness to God. So when Bernardetta claimed her body was merely a vessel, her love merely an act of divine will, it gave her cover. For a while, she began performing miracles, healing small illnesses, making predictions. She gained followers both inside and outside the convent. Bartolomea, meanwhile, became her closest companion, her confidant, her partner, her other half. They were inseparable, and their relationship was passionate, physical, unashamed, but cloaked in divine narrative. Bernardetta wrote letters describing their connection as a sacrament without sacrilege. She spoke of divine union made manifest in flesh. She said that what passed between her and Bartolomea was not sin, but revelation. It was the perfect theological twist. The very thing the church feared, same-sex love, was being reframed as holy mysticism. And for years it worked. Until someone questioned it. Historians aren't sure who made the first accusation. Perhaps a jealous sister, perhaps a suspicious confessor. But the church launched an investigation. And what they found scandalized the clergy. Bernardetta had written her own prayers, invented her own rituals, claimed to channel Jesus, the Virgin, and unnamed celestial beings. And always, these revelations drew her closer to Bartolomea. The two had shared a bed, bathed together, fasted together, carried out secret ceremonies. One document claims they exchanged vows. Another describes an altar they built in a hidden part of the convent. The church interrogated them. And what did Bernardetta do? She did not back down. She claimed that every act, every kiss, every touch, every whispered word was divinely commanded. That the angels still visited her. That Bartolomea was a vessel of divine grace. She didn't say, "We broke the rules." She said, "Your rules don't apply to God." It was heresy, blasphemy, unthinkable. And yet, the church couldn't dismiss her outright. They feared public backlash. They feared exposing how deeply they had already endorsed her mystical experiences. So they conducted a secret trial. Behind closed doors. Quiet. Controlled. Bernardetta was declared deluded. Not evil. Not possessed. Just confused. She was stripped of leadership. Confined to a small cell. Forbidden to speak. Forbidden to write. Forbidden from ever seeing Bartolomea again. And Bartolomea? She was transferred. Silently. No punishment recorded. No public shame. It said that she wept for 3 days. And then was never heard from again. Bernardetta lived out her years in isolation. But her fire never dimmed. In her final writings, smuggled out and preserved in fragments, she wrote, "They silenced me, but I have already spoken. They caged me, but I am already free. For I have known a love so bright that even angels bowed." These are not the words of a woman who regretted. These are the words of a prophetess. A revolutionary, a mystic whose most sacred revelation was love. Love not as rebellion, but as theology. Love not as temptation, but as transcendence. Bernardetta Carlini turned the entire system on its head. She exposed the hypocrisy of a church that celebrated spiritual ecstasy, but punished emotional truth. She challenged the belief that the divine could only work through men. She asked the most dangerous question of all. What if our love is holy? And no one had an answer. Even today, scholars struggle to define her. Was she mad? A visionary? A victim? A feminist before her time? Or simply a woman who loved deeply and refused to lie about it? Whatever you believe, one thing is certain. She changed everything. She made it impossible for the church to pretend that love between women was just fleeting temptation. She made them see it as real, powerful, uncontrollable. And in doing so, she joined the long line of women who risked everything to say, "I choose her. I claim her. In the name of heaven itself." So let us remember Bernardetta not as scandal, but as scripture. Not as shame, but as sacred story. Because she didn't just love Bartolomea. She wrote their love into the very language of God. In the vast halls of medieval history, there are few women whose names echo like a song through time. One of them is Hildegard of Bingen, abbess, mystic, composer, scientist, healer, philosopher. She was a force of nature in an age that told women to be silent. But what many don't know, what history has tried to whisper and quickly bury, is that Hildegard wasn't just a saintly figure draped in holiness. She was a woman of fierce emotion, powerful loyalty, and deep, unmistakable love. And when she loved, she did not do it in halves. She loved another woman. Her name was Richardis von Stade. Their relationship wasn't just tender, it was profound. It shaped Hildegard's life and work. And when the church tried to tear them apart, Hildegard didn't simply grieve. She fought. She used every ounce of her influence, not only to protect Richardis, but to shield other women like them. And in doing so, she quietly reshaped the very nature of convent life. Hildegard wasn't born into power. Like most girls in the 11th century, her life was shaped by the decisions of men. At the age of 8, she was given to a monastery, not quite a nun, not quite free. She lived in silence for years, observing, learning. And from that silence emerged brilliance. Visions, music, medical knowledge far ahead of her time, letters to emperors, sermons to bishops. And then Richardis, young, noble, eager to serve, assigned to Hildegard's convent. The two women bonded quickly, deeply. Ricciardi's became Hildegard's secretary, her closest companion, her sole mirror. Their letters, preserved through centuries, are overflowing with affection that defies mere friendship. Hildegard wrote, "You are the sparkle in my eye, the balm in my soul. Without you I am a shadow." And again, "My heart is laid bare before you. You know me more deeply than any man ever has or ever could." This was not the language of the strictly spiritual. This was emotional truth. Was their relationship romantic? Was it physical? We cannot say with certainty. But we don't need to. Because what matters is this: it was real. It was intimate. It was central to both their lives. And it was endangered by the Church's fear. Ricciardi's, though devoted to Hildegard, was offered a higher post at another convent, one with more wealth, more prestige. A strategic move by her noble family and powerful clerics. Hildegard begged her not to go. She wrote letters to bishops, to abbots, even to the Pope. "She is mine," she wrote, "not in possession but in soul. To remove her is to cut out the living part of my heart." But Ricciardi's left. Hildegard was devastated. She refused to speak to others for days. She fell into illness. Her visions grew dark. Her music became mournful. And then tragedy. Ricciardi's died less than a year later. And in a final aching letter, Hildegard wrote, "I did not deserve this wound, but I carry it now and forever." Yet from that wound grew something extraordinary. Hildegard did not retreat. She rose. She founded new convents, ***, places where women could think, create, study, and love *** with less fear. She rewrote the rules of community life. Where most abbesses enforced strict silence, Hildegard encouraged singing. Where others imposed rigid hierarchy, she taught mutual respect. She trained her sisters in herbal medicine, music, astronomy, and theology. She gave women a place not just to serve, but to thrive. And she protected them. When priests came snooping, she defended her sisters fiercely. When bishops questioned her authority, she quoted scripture back at them. She used her visions as armor, claiming divine inspiration for her decisions, daring anyone to contradict her without challenging God himself. And beneath all this, she nurtured a secret culture of safety. She never publicly endorsed relationships between women. That would have been fatal, but she quietly allowed them. She turned a blind eye to the particular friendships. She paired women in shared rooms. She permitted long walks in the garden. She allowed emotional letters to go uncensored. And in her writings, so layered with metaphor, one can find subtle traces of understanding. Passages that speak of souls bound in mutual fire, of love that surpasses earthly knowledge, of hearts joined beyond comprehension. These were more than mystical phrases. They were reflections of what she had felt for Ricciardi's, and what she saw blooming all around her. Because Hildegard understood what the Church refused to admit, that when you lock women away together, when you give them no husband, no outlet, no voice, ***, they will create their own world, their own bonds, their own sacred truths, ***. And she didn't fear that. She embraced it. In her music, we hear that freedom. Her chants rise and fall like breath, unrestrained, expansive, feminine. Unlike the flat Gregorian tones of male choirs, Hildegard's compositions shimmer with emotion, with longing, with joy. She wrote over 70 musical pieces, many dedicated to the Virgin Mary, yes, but always with layers, always with mystery. One hymn, O Ignis Spiritus Paracliti, sings not just of God's fire, but of fire between souls. The lines seem to breathe. O burning spirit, who binds the limbs of the human heart with love. You can hear it. She knew. She knew what love could do, how it could destroy, how it could heal. And she chose to protect it, to make room for it. In a time when women who loved each other were punished, tortured, erased, Hildegard carved out space. Quietly, cleverly, compassionately. And because of her, many women found freedom they would never have known elsewhere. She is remembered now as a saint, a doctor of the Church, a visionary. But she was more than that. She was a sanctuary, a shield against cruelty, a refuge for the different, a voice for the unheard. She couldn't save Ricciardi's, but she saved many others. And through her music, her writings, her letters, she left behind not just theology, but testimony, a witness to the power of women's connection, a reminder that love, when protected, can transform even the harshest walls into sacred gardens. So when we remember Hildegard, let us remember her not just in robes and chants, but in fire and song. Let us remember her as a woman who loved deeply, fought bravely, and opened the door for others to love without shame. She wasn't just history's holy woman. She was its quiet revolutionary. Imagine loving someone in a world that wants your love to disappear. Now imagine doing it while locked behind stone walls, with eyes watching you from every corner and ears pressed to every keyhole. Where trust is a luxury and silence, deep, aching silence, is the only thing that keeps you alive. This was the world the nuns lived in once the Inquisition arrived. It began with a whisper, a suspicious glance, a sister not kneeling fast enough, not singing loud enough, a friendship that seemed too close, a hand held too long, and then the silence would break. Not with answers, but with fear. The church had built entire systems to seek out heretics. But now their attention had turned inward, to convents, to women, to love between them. Because what scared them most was not sin, but disobedience. Not sex, but sovereignty. A woman who loved another woman didn't just break rules. She refused to belong to a man. And that, to the church, was unforgivable. They launched investigations. Not openly, not with justice, but with shadow and threat. Priests were trained to look for particular friendships. Manuals instructed abbesses on how to detect emotional attachment. Confessors were taught to dig deeper, to twist answers, to sow guilt where none existed. Fear became a language. A woman might be interrogated for speaking too kindly, for crying when her companion was moved, for gifting a handmade cross. No evidence needed, just a rumor. Just jealousy. Just a single misinterpreted letter. And if she denied it, they brought in the healers. You see, the church couldn't call these women criminals outright, especially if they came from noble families or had taken public vows. So they framed their love not as defiance, but as illness. They said it was a medical problem, a spiritual contamination, a physical disorder. And so they turned to the science of the time, a gruesome, ignorant arsenal of medieval misogyny. Physicians claimed that women who loved other women were victims of a wandering womb. An idea that the uterus, untethered by childbirth or a man's seed, traveled the body and disrupted the mind. Others said these women had too much masculine energy or had been born under confused stars. Some even claimed they had grown invisible phalluses, an idea so absurd, yet so deeply believed, it shaped treatments for centuries. The so-called cures were nothing less than torture. Nuns were subjected to bloodletting, sometimes to the point of unconsciousness. Others were locked in cold baths, their skin wrinkling as hours passed. Some were burned, not with fire, but with heated instruments applied to their genitals, all in the name of corrective healing. They were forced to consume bitter herbs meant to cool the blood or quiet unnatural fire. Some were denied sleep. Others were given forced confessions to recite, daily, endlessly, until they forgot their own truths. In the worst cases, they were raped. Not as punishment, but as therapy. Men hired by the church claimed that physical penetration could remind a woman of her purpose, could restore the order of nature. And all the while, these women were told they were possessed, that demons had seduced them, that their love was not theirs, but Satan's whisper. Imagine the confusion, the pain, the betrayal, because these were women of faith, women who had given their lives to the church, women who believed in salvation, in devotion, in prayer. And now, those same prayers were being used as weapons against them. One sister, Maria of Verona, was tied to the floor of her cell for weeks. Every time she moved, the chains cut deeper. Her food was reduced to scraps. She was allowed no contact. When she finally broke, she didn't confess to sin. She simply said, "I am tired of being alone." Another, Sister Elodia, was accused after she was seen weeping at her friend's funeral. Her tears were proof of unnatural affection. She was bled, beaten, and forced to watch others burned as warning. But even in this darkness, the women resisted. They didn't shout. They didn't fight. But they remembered. They held on to the names of those they loved. They etched initials beneath pews. They pressed their foreheads to walls where they had once kissed. They prayed, not to be cleansed, but to be forgiven for surviving. And some never stopped loving, even after punishment, even after years of separation. Even after the church told them they were sick, they were sinful, they were shameful, they remembered love. They wrote letters that were never sent. They hummed songs only their beloved would know. They told stories to younger nuns, softly, like parables. Once, they'd say, there were two sisters who shared the same dream every night. And those stories became seeds. Seeds of defiance. Because if the Inquisition hoped to destroy these women with fear, it underestimated one thing. A heart that has loved truly never forgets. Yes, communities were torn apart. Yes, sisters turned on each other. Yes, some recanted, some died, some disappeared into silence. But some endured. Their love became folklore. Their names became legend. Their pain became the foundation for every woman who dared to feel afterward. And centuries later, we still read their confessions. We still uncover their medical records. We still find their initials scratched into wood, their prayers rewritten in the margins of psalters, their hair braided into relics. These weren't just victims. They were survivors of a system that dressed cruelty in robes and called it healing. They were women who loved despite everything. And every time we speak of them, every time we say their names, even in hushed tones, we undo a little bit of that silence. We remind the world that no system, no manual, no test, no terror can fully destroy love. Not when it's written into skin. Not when it's buried beneath stone. Not when it's passed from soul to soul like a secret song. Power, in the medieval world, didn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wore a veil. Sometimes it knelt in prayer while secretly writing letters behind closed doors. Sometimes it moved through hallways in silence, but could stop an investigation with a single glance. And sometimes it protected love by paying for it, disguising it, and daring the church to interfere. In the hidden world of convents, where love between women blossomed in shadows, the quiet power of money was often the difference between survival and destruction. Because while all nuns wore the same habit, not all entered with the same weight behind their names. Some came with noble blood, with lands, with family crests etched into marble. They brought with them hefty dowries, sometimes enough to feed the entire convent for a year. These dowries weren't just gifts. They were armor. They bought safety, silence, protection. Others came with nothing. No name, no wealth, no one on the outside who cared whether they lived, died, or were transferred in shame. And the church, righteous as it claimed to be, played favorites. A wealthy nun caught in a particular friendship might be reprimanded quietly, moved to another cell, warned gently. Her family would be informed, but not alarmed. After all, what was a little affection between sisters? Better not to make a scandal. But a poor nun? She might be interrogated, punished, publicly humiliated, used as an example to the others, because she had nothing the convent feared losing. This is the hidden truth of that world. Not all sin was treated equally. And the abbesses knew it. Some used that knowledge to suppress. But others used it to protect. In convents led by clever, compassionate women, new systems began to form. Discreet protection networks funded by wealthy families, designed to shield daughters from the church's harshest punishments. They didn't call them insurance plans. But that's exactly what they were. A noble family would offer a larger dowry, often in installments. In return, the abbess would promise discretion, privacy, a guarantee that, should their daughter form an attachment, it would be handled quietly. No scandal, no expulsion, no Vatican involvement. Some abbesses even kept hidden ledgers, columns for gold, for land, for promises. And in the margins, initials. Quiet names, codes for who was to be left alone. This wasn't corruption. This was protection in a world where protection was rare. And it saved lives. It allowed women to write letters without fear of confiscation, to sleep beside someone they loved without fearing sudden reassignment, to grow old next to the soul who made the silence bearable. But it wasn't just about money. It was about strategy. Abbesses negotiated. They bargained with bishops. They maintained good relations with local lords. They offered gifts at just the right moment. And in return, they carved out tiny kingdoms of autonomy, convents where surveillance softened and affection could live in secret. In one such convent, records show that sisters were allowed to request roommates. The pairing process was quiet, unspoken, but everyone understood. Those who came with powerful families usually got what they asked for. In another, the abbess deliberately scheduled meditation hours, where certain women would walk the gardens, always in the same pairs. Always with just enough privacy to speak, to smile, to touch fingers beneath long sleeves. It wasn't freedom, but it was safety. It was enough. And the wealthy families? They weren't ignorant. Many knew, or at least suspected. But they preferred this quiet affection over scandalous marriage. Better a daughter cloistered in prayer, with a companion, than one lost to disgrace or a disastrous union. And so they paid. And some abbesses went even further. They created coded rituals of protection. Secret rooms where letters could be exchanged. Chapel pews marked for those under observation. Extra blessings said at Mass, spoken slowly enough to allow for messages in the pauses. These systems weren't written down. They lived in whispers, in the passing of rings, in the silence between hymns. And they worked, but not always. Sometimes the church sent someone too ambitious. A priest eager for promotion. A bishop desperate to prove his zeal. And when that happened, even wealth couldn't protect everyone. A well-born nun might be spared, but her lover, if she came from nothing, might not. One story tells of Sister Mirabel, daughter of a wealthy merchant. Her family gave the convent enough money to repair its roof, rebuild its garden wall. She was gentle, curious, quiet. And she fell in love with Sister Sabina, a commoner. A brilliant herbalist, sharp-tongued, fiercely loyal. When their relationship was discovered, the abbess tried to intervene. She called in favors, offered more gold. But it wasn't enough. Mirabel was moved to another convent, luxurious, protected, untouched. Sabina? She was confined, accused of manipulation, of seduction, of unnatural desire. She died 3 months later from untreated infection. Left alone in a cold cell, her name removed from the records. Mirabel wore black every day for the rest of her life. So yes, the system was flawed. And yes, wealth often bought comfort at someone else's cost. But it also kept something alive. It allowed women, some women, to write poetry that wasn't confiscated, to exchange vows that weren't interrupted, to age beside the one person who made life inside the walls bearable. It allowed love to survive just long enough to be remembered. And those abbesses, those quiet, calculating protectors, were often the unsung heroes. They worked within the church but bent its rules at every edge. They shielded their sisters not with swords, but with smiles. With ledgers, with secrets. They understood that in a world ruled by men, money could speak where women could not. And they used that voice with precision. So the next time someone says the convent was a place of purity, remember this. It was also a place of deals, of protection paid in gold, of love bought in silence. And behind those deals, behind those rings and ledgers, behind every kept secret, stood a woman with a key, a candle, and a promise. No one will hurt you. Not here. Not while I breathe. Women continued to love and resist through subtle codes. Some even created martyrdom rituals to honor loss. There are loves that burn bright in daylight, witnessed, celebrated, remembered. And then there are the loves that bloom in darkness, hidden beneath veils, buried under silence. These are the loves that history tried to erase. But the women who lived those stories didn't let it happen. They knew their love might never be written into scripture or painted onto chapel ceilings. But they also knew something deeper, something bolder. If the world wouldn't remember them, they'd remember each other. Even in death. Even in pain. Even if it cost them everything. When persecution grew, when the Inquisition deepened its claws, when lovers were separated, punished, or executed, the women didn't stop loving. They simply learned how to carry love through loss, how to turn grief into ritual, how to encode memory into prayer. They created what historians now call martyrdom rituals. Not in the grand sense, no blazing pyres or canonizations, but quiet, sacred rites passed from one heart to another. Acts of remembrance so intimate, so personal, that they defied the very systems that tried to destroy them. In one convent near Milan, a young nun named Serena died shortly after her lover was discovered and reassigned. The official record says Serena died of consumption. But her sisters knew better. She had stopped eating, stopped speaking. Her light went out the moment the one she loved vanished from her world. After her burial, the other nuns returned to the chapel. They didn't weep aloud. They didn't speak her name. But that night, they placed 3 candles instead of one beside the altar, each at different heights. It was a signal, a code. 1 candle for Serena, 1 for her lover, 1 for the vow they made and never broke. This was their ritual, their way of saying, "We remember you." And this happened everywhere. Women found ways to memorialize each other in song, in embroidery, in breath. They rewrote psalms with altered words. "My soul thirsts for thee" became. "My soul remembers her. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow" became. "Though she walk before me, I still follow." In another convent, sisters who lost their beloveds began marking their palms with ash every year on the same day. Not Ash Wednesday, Not Easter, but the anniversary of the day their love was taken, from punishment, from death, from transfer. This was their grief. This was their defiance. This was their sacrament. Some even rewrote the death rites. One abbess, known only through anonymous letters, allowed her sisters to slip small tokens into the graves of their lovers. A ribbon, a carved stone, a lock of hair, all illegal, all dangerous, all sacred. But the most powerful ritual of all? The way they remembered through art. When the world stole their words, they drew. They etched initials into the edges of illuminated manuscripts. They painted floral borders with specific flowers, violets for loyalty, myrtle for eternal love. They arranged choir notes to mimic their lover's name in Latin numerals. One sister embroidered a curtain for the chapel. In its folds, invisible to most, were stitched the words, Amavayim sikat on imami. I loved her as my soul. The priest never noticed, but her sisters did. They passed their secrets through generation, not by books, but by gesture. A candle lit at an odd hour. A song hummed under breath. A glance held too long during Mass. And when a beloved died, they wrote prayers not to God but to her. One found in a preserved convent journal reads, She who walked beside me in silence, I now ask you to walk beside me in memory. Let your breath be in my lungs. Let your laughter echo in the bells. Let me dream of you until we kneel side by side again, in some heaven not yet written. Some even created entire seasons of mourning. They refused to wear flowers, refused to smile, refused to speak during feasts. And no one dared question it, because within those walls, the pain of losing the one person who made life livable could not be questioned. But the church wanted these memories gone. They feared them, because they were too strong, because they lasted. They tried to root them out by burning letters, banning paired cellmates, reassigning women constantly to break bonds. But still the rituals lived, because the women passed them quietly, folded into blessings, hidden in footnotes, whispered before bed. Some invented saints, names not found in any church registry, but known in their hearts. Saint Lysandra, Saint Corinne, Saint Elena, names of lost loves spoken in prayer. Saint Elena, protect me from forgetting. Saint Corinne, keep her laughter in my dreams. Saint Lysandra, watch over the hands that once held mine. And even in death, these women found ways to return to each other. Some convents buried lovers side by side, illegally, without inscription. But the sisters would know. They'd plant specific flowers, leave paired shoes beside the grave, draw matching symbols in chalk once a year, before the morning sweepers arrived. One grave in Belgium, uncovered centuries later, held two women. One had a ring in her hand, the other, a lock of hair beneath her ribcage. They had been buried holding one another. Hidden, but not forgotten. This wasn't romanticism. This was survival. This was how they built their own theology of remembrance. A belief that even if the church refused to honor their love, they could canonize each other. In word, in thread, in fire, in stone. And through these martyrdom rituals, they gave each other the dignity the world denied them. Because in the end, love, true love, is not measured by permission. It's measured by how fiercely it refuses to fade. So yes, the church tried to kill memory. But the women had already built temples inside their hearts. And those temples still stand. In the chants that carry unfamiliar names. In the stained glass with two doves instead of one. In the margins of ancient books where someone scribbled, I loved her. I still do. The convent was silent. Always silent. But inside that silence lived entire conversations. Not spoken. Not written. Not shouted or sung. But seen. Felt. Known. Because when love was forbidden, when grief was punished, when the mere act of remembering someone was treated like sin, women learned to speak without words. They invented a language no priest could decode. A grammar of glances. A syntax of gestures. A vocabulary built from the positioning of candles, the shift of a shoulder, the delay of a prayer by half a beat. This was how they survived. They didn't fight with rebellion. They fought with stillness, with timing, with silence that pulsed with meaning. One woman, Sister Odetta, once told her novice, "You do not need to speak to be heard. You need only to be understood by the right eyes." And so these women made their bodies into poems, their prayers into letters, their grief into resistance. Let's begin where it hurts the most, the loss. Because every love inside the convent walls lived on borrowed time. All it took was one jealous eye, one intercepted letter, one priest with too much ambition, and she would be taken, reassigned, moved to another abbey, or worse. And so the women found ways to say goodbye without saying goodbye. They rewrote prayers. Not entirely, just enough to carry a second meaning. Instead of praying, "Deliver me from evil," one whispered, "deliver her safely to morning." Instead of "Thy will be done," she'd murmur, "Her name be done in peace." Instead of "Forgive us our trespasses," she'd plead, "Forgive me for loving her so openly." These weren't just substitutions. They were acts of devotion. And when someone was lost, taken, exiled, or buried, those rewritten prayers became holy rites. One nun, after her beloved was excommunicated, chanted the same altered psalm for 40 nights. She walked beside me in the valley of silence, and though her voice is gone, her echo remains. It was never recorded, but the sisters remembered, because they too had lost. And each time a woman lit a candle slightly to the left of the altar, just a finger's width more than usual, others would nod. They knew what it meant. I'm thinking of her. If the wick was trimmed short, it meant mourning. If the flame was snuffed early, it meant fear. If the candle dripped in 2 slow streams, arranged deliberately, it meant we were once 2. Now I am 1. These were not accidents. They were coded messages, read only by those who needed to see them. Body language became its own liturgy. A breath drawn in too slowly during Mass. A kneel that began just after the bell. A folded hand over the heart instead of the lap. A bow that lasted a moment too long when passing another woman. To the priests, it all looked the same. To the sisters, it screamed with meaning. I still love you. I remember. I'm sorry. Forgive me. I'm here. Even the way they walked spoke volumes. If 2 women passed each other and their hands brushed, even for a heartbeat, it was a miracle. A resurrection. A reminder that their love still had skin. And when they were punished, when one was sent away, they left behind marks. One woman, Sister Leonora, carved a small cross into the bottom of a prayer bench. Not at the center. At the edge. Tilted slightly. A message. I was here. I loved. I'm gone now, but I was real. Another, Sister Vivian, was taken from the convent in disgrace. Before she left, she smeared wax in the shape of a heart onto the corner of the lectern. It hardened overnight. The next morning, Sister Emilienne placed her palm on that wax during song, and held it there for the entire hymn. Not a word passed between them. But it was enough. This was micro-resistance. Resistance so small it looked like nothing to those in power. But to the women living inside it, it was everything. It was breath. It was blood. It was love alive in exile. Some even developed entire rituals, using only their bodies. During evening prayer, they would sit 3 benches apart. Always 3. Never 2. Never 4. Because 3 meant I love you, I forgive you, I wait for you. When lighting candles, they would pass the flame hand to hand, fingertips brushing, a slow inhale shared between them. When reading scripture aloud, one would pause ever so slightly before saying beloved. A hesitation, a crack in the rhythm, a tear in the page, and the other would blink once. Twice. Yes, it meant. I know. I feel it too. Even in death, these codes lived. When a woman passed, her friends would rearrange her belongings just so. 2 combs crossed at the vanity. A scarf folded into a heart. A final note, unsigned, tucked into the psalter on page 143. Always 143. The numerical code for I love you. 143. Simple. Hidden. Eternal. These were not grand gestures. They were whispers. But when the world demands your silence, whispers are sacred. And the church never understood. They saw women kneeling, praying, singing, obeying. They never saw what lived beneath. The half-second delay in a hymn. The tilt of a head toward a passing shadow. The candle that burned just a little too long. The prayer said with fingers trembling. These women did not stop loving. They just changed the way love moved. They made it smaller, sharper, invisible to outsiders but blazing inside. It was survival. It was mourning. It was hope. Because as long as someone understood the code, then love was not gone. It was simply speaking in a new tongue. So yes, they were silent, but they spoke in firelight, in breathing patterns, in blinks, in folded cloth and flicked fingers, in the rhythm of their footsteps down the nave. And if anyone ever doubted it, all they had to do was kneel where she had once knelt, and feel it, still warm, still waiting, still echoing. There's a particular kind of cruelty that wears the mask of reason, a brutality wrapped in logic. That's what the church and its physicians gave these women, not just punishment, but justification for it. Because when women in convents began to love each other, openly, secretly, defiantly, the church panicked. And instead of calling it what it was, love, they gave it another name. They called it disease. And then they set out to cure it. According to the so-called science of the medieval world, a woman could not possibly love another woman unless something was wrong inside her. Her organs were confused, her soul twisted, her flesh possessed. They spoke with authority, with scripture, with the quill of doctors who had never touched a woman with kindness, only with control. They said that lesbian desire was caused by a wandering womb. A uterus that, left barren, would drift through the body like a mischievous spirit, pressing on the heart, clouding the brain, making a woman yearn unnaturally for another. Others insisted that some women had too much masculine energy, that their bodies generated a strange internal heat, making them aggressive, carnal, and disobedient, a threat to the order of things. And the worst theory of all? That these women were possessed by demons, that a succubus had whispered into their dreams, that Satan himself had entered their souls and made them crave each other like beasts. Not as people, but as monsters. It was convenient, because if love was an illness, then it could be treated. Or worse, corrected. So came the cures. Some women were told to sleep on cold stones, to lower their internal heat. Others were forced to sit in salt water until their skin cracked. To cleanse the womb, the priest said. Many were bled, over and over again. Arms, ankles, necks. A belief that bloodletting would drain out impure desire like poison from a wound. Some were cauterized, hot irons applied to the thighs, the stomach, the genitals, under the guise of resetting the balance of humors. Some were raped, because it was believed that heterosexual intercourse would fix them, that if they were reminded of their purpose, their desire would realign. This was not healing. This was violence, and the church turned its face away. And when even that didn't work, they performed exorcisms. Women were tied to wooden planks, held down as holy water was flung into their faces. Priests shouted verses. Nuns were forced to confess unholy visions under fear of damnation. They were starved, isolated, broken, and some, many, died. From infection, from despair, from shame so deep they could no longer carry it. But even in this nightmare, something astonishing happened. Some women fought back, not with swords, not with rebellion, but with cleverness. If the church insisted lesbian love was a sickness, then fine. They'd call it a sickness, not a sin. That distinction saved lives. They began to fake symptoms, physical ones. Numbness, dizziness, fits. They claimed headaches, womb pain, fever. Anything that could divert the church's judgment away from the soul and toward the body. Because sickness could be treated. Sin had to be punished. One nun, Sister Clara of Tours, was accused of being too close to another woman. During interrogation, she fainted on cue. Claimed her womb had been climbing toward her chest. The priest brought a physician. She was bled and given herbs. No confession was forced. The other nun was spared entirely. They lived together another 10 years. In another convent, 2 women who had exchanged love letters claimed they had both been struck by the same demon, who disguised herself as a female angel. They were put through mild exorcisms, then left alone. Because the church, for all its power, feared illness more than love. It could not argue with symptoms. It could only treat. And so a strange irony took root. The same bogus science used to persecute became a shield. These women weaponized ignorance. They learned to cry on cue, to tremble, to sweat during questioning, to say just enough to be treated, never enough to be condemned. They memorized symptoms, played roles, and beneath it all they kept loving, because they knew the truth. They knew their love was not illness, not possession, not imbalance, not sin. It was the only thing that had ever made them feel whole. So they survived, through strategy, through silence, through performance, and sometimes through small, sharp acts of resistance. One woman, after being cured of her affections, carved a phrase into her wooden bedpost. "My soul was never sick, only theirs." Another wrote her final confession and signed, and hid it beneath the chapel floor. It was found centuries later. It read, "I have loved, not wrongly, not wickedly, but deeply. And if that damns me, so be it. I will walk through hell hand in hand with her. History tells us about the treatments, the horrors, the absurdities. But what it often forgets to tell us is this. These women outwitted the machine. They danced circles around doctrine. They played sick to stay sane. They pretended to be lost so they could be found again, in each other's arms. They used the enemy's weapons to build sanctuary. And when they could no longer fight, they remembered. When they could no longer speak, they wrote. When they could no longer live, they made their love impossible to forget. So yes, medieval science was absurd. Yes, the church used fear disguised as healing. Yes, countless women suffered. But they never truly won. Because these women, these saints of silence, these heroines of cleverness, they left behind something stronger than wounds. They left behind memory. And memory cannot be exorcised. We often think of love behind convent walls as tragic, cut short by punishment, torn apart by cruelty, buried by time. And yes, many stories ended that way. But not all. Because somewhere, tucked into quiet corners of forgotten abbeys, love survived. It didn't shout. It didn't blaze. But it burned. Slowly. Steadily. Unyielding. Some women grew old together. Not in public celebration, but in private, wordless understanding. And in that understanding, they built something rare. Something sacred. A marriage of hearts, hidden from the world, but no less real. It started simply. Two women assigned to the same duties, kitchen, scriptorium, garden. Day by day, year by year, the rhythm of their lives intertwined. One would wake the other. One would wash linen while the other poured water. They would sing side by side in chapel, kneel together in confession, exchange glances in the candlelight of vespers. Over time, it became something deeper than friendship. A glance turned into a touch into a ritual into a lifetime. They didn't need vows. Theirs were made in silence. I will rise when you rise. I will pray when you falter. I will hold your memory inside mine until death takes one of us, and even then, I will remain. One such couple was Sister Mariel and Sister Elia, who lived in a convent near Avignon. They were never accused, never punished. Perhaps they were careful. Perhaps their abbess understood. Or perhaps the other sisters simply chose not to see what they already knew. They shared a cell for over 30 years. Their letters, hidden in the margins of prayer books, speak not of fire and lust, but of daily devotion. Today you coughed, and I could not breathe. Your voice trembled during Psalm 91, and I held the final note until I knew you were steady. I placed lavender beneath your pillow. It is the only medicine I trust. They weren't lovers in the modern sense. They were lifelong companions, soul mirrors, spiritual wives. And the most beautiful part? They were buried side by side. Their tombstones bore no names. Just two doves, carved into the limestone, facing each other with wings slightly touching. The sisters understood. And they never disturbed that grave. Because even in a world that forbade everything, love found a way to be eternal. There were others. In Germany, Sister Annika and Sister Sophie spent their last decades in the same convent infirmary. They were old, their hair white, their hands bent with arthritis. But every morning, Sophie brushed Annika's hair. Every evening, Annika washed Sophie's feet. One of the younger nuns once asked why. Sophie smiled and said, "Because she would do the same for me, even if I forgot her name." They were buried together, their fingers still linked under the shroud. And then there were the symbols. Because these women knew they could not ask for recognition. So they left messages in stone, in art, in ritual. Some had identical crosses placed at their graves, carved not with dates, but with matching lines from the Psalms. I have found a dwelling place. She is my refuge and my fortress. Others requested to be buried with matching relics. A strand of hair tied in red ribbon, a worn copy of the same prayer book, a piece of shared cloth from their room. In one remarkable case, 2 women were buried under the floor of the convent chapel, each in a stone niche side by side. The inscriptions were faded, but above them was etched a single Latin phrase. Una in fide, una in amore. One in faith, one in love. It wasn't official church language, but the sisters who came after kept it clean, maintained the candles, whispered stories, because they knew. They all knew. Love like that leaves a mark, not just in graveyards, but in rooms, in traditions, in echoes. And these women built entire lives from love's silence. They kept each other's secrets. They tended to each other's wounds. They grew old watching the same garden bloom, listening to the same hymns, tracing the same stars above the convent roof each night. And when one died, the other grieved not like a friend, but like a widow. One nun, after losing her beloved, stopped singing entirely. She walked the halls in black, placed 2 spoons on the table at every meal. One for herself, one for the one who was gone. No one asked her to stop. Some abbesses understood. Some didn't. But most convents had at least one pair like this. 2 women. No accusations. No punishments. No scandal. Just a shared life. A long, quiet partnership made of routine, care, and sacred stillness. We don't always hear about them, because theirs were not the stories filled with drama and fire. But they are perhaps the most beautiful stories of all. Because they made something impossible. Endure Love lived gently, day after day, without permission, without recognition, but also without regret. These women prove that sometimes survival is the greatest act of love, and that even in a world that tried to erase them, even in silence, even in secrecy, even in shadows, they won, because they got what so many dream of. Not just love, but time. In a world where women were bought, married, silenced, and spent like coin, there was one strange refuge. One loophole in the script written by men. The convent. Not perfect. Not free. But for many women, it was the only place they could live a life not ruled by fathers, brothers, or husbands. And within its stone walls, behind veils and candles and ritual, something extraordinary happened. They found each other. Not just as companions. Not just as sisters in faith. But as partners in love. In the medieval world, almost every female relationship was shaped by male control. Daughters were promised off in childhood. Wives were absorbed into their husbands' identities. Widows were expected to vanish into mourning. But in the convent, 2 women could share a room for life. They could walk side by side every day, pray together, sleep under the same roof, grow old without ever being separated. It didn't always mean romance, but often it did. And even when it didn't, it meant deep, emotional intimacy that no man could interrupt. These were bonds formed without negotiation, without coercion, without transaction. For the first time, perhaps the only time, a woman could choose another woman That simple act was revolutionary. Some scholars now say that convents were the birthplaces of queer history. Not because they were filled with secret weddings or open rebellion, but because they offered space, time, privacy, continuity, In a world where queer people had no name, no voice, and no place to belong, these women carved out a home in silence. They did not write manifestos. They wrote poems, letters, prayers with altered lines, verses filled with longing and code. They did not march. They knelt. But the kneeling was not submission. It was survival. It was strategy. It was how they held on to each other when the world tried to pull them apart. And those bonds, they lasted. Some for decades, some until death, some beyond death, because they refused to forget. And now neither can we. Their stories survive, not in history books but in fragments. A dried flower tucked inside a psalter. 2 graves placed just a few feet closer than the rules allowed. A phrase like, "She was my other self," found scratched into the base of a candle holder. They left behind trails, whispers between the lines. We see it in the language of their letters, how they called each other my heart, my soul companion, my chosen half. We see it in their art, 2 women embroidered into robes, hands nearly touching, halos nearly overlapping. We see it in the psalms they rewrote, in the songs they composed together, in the way they referred to each other as the one God sent to walk with me. And we hear it in the silences of their recorded histories, the places where pages were torn, names erased, ink smeared just enough to hide the truth. Those smudges? They speak louder than ink ever could, because someone tried to forget, and that means someone remembered. And that memory is a legacy, not just for women, not just for nuns, but for anyone who has ever had to hide their heart in a coded phrase. Anyone who's ever whispered, "I love you," in a language no one else could hear. These convents, these women, these bonds, they gave us the roots of something brave and beautiful. They showed us that love doesn't need validation to be sacred. It doesn't need recognition to be real. It only needs 2 people willing to see each other fully and protect that vision, even in silence. And their courage didn't disappear. It lives on in queer people today who build their own families, in secret smiles exchanged across rooms, in rituals reclaimed, in lovers who still walk the world's margins, daring to make space for tenderness. It lives on in every person who chooses love over fear, in every one of us who dares to speak what others have been told to forget. So when we light candles for them, these women in the shadows, we are not mourning. We are remembering. We are continuing. We are whispering back. We saw you. We heard you. You lived. You loved. And you will never be forgotten. History is not a neutral mirror. It is a carefully polished surface, one that reflects only what those in power choose to show. And behind that surface, beyond the stained glass and gilded books, there are missing stories. Stories of women, of longing, of sacred secret love, and of how the church, so devoted to its own image, tried to erase them all. They didn't burn every letter. They didn't smash every grave. But they did something colder, slower, and far more permanent. They made the world forget. Let's go back to a small convent in northern Italy. 2 women lived there, Sister Leora and Sister Ginevra. For 30 years they served, sang, worked, and prayed side by side. When Ginevra died, Leora fell into silence. She refused food, refused light. She wore her lover's rosary as a bracelet until the day she too passed. Their graves were laid side by side. Carved into one was a line from the Psalms. My soul is bound to hers in eternal accord. It stayed there for 50 years. Then one day a new bishop arrived. He read the inscription, and within a week it was chiseled off. No explanation, no ritual, just gone. Not because it was profane, but because it was true, because it told a story the church didn't want told. That women had loved each other, not just as friends, but as partners. Not as sinners, but as soulmates. Not in defiance of God, but in his quiet presence. And that truth, gentle as it was, terrified them. So they erased it. And they did this everywhere. When letters between nuns were found, letters blooming with devotion, coded poems, shared metaphors of longing, they were seized. Not catalogued, not debated, burned. Abbesses who protected their sisters were quietly removed. Manuscripts were edited, names omitted, locations blurred, affection reworded. One such letter once read, "Your breath steadies my world." After ecclesiastical editing, it became, "Your presence improves my discipline." Another once ended with, "Forever yours as bride is to bride." It was rewritten to say, "Forever in Christ." Small changes, but powerful ones. They didn't have to destroy the stories. They just had to sanitize them, to make them safe, holy in the church's eyes, empty in ours. And sometimes they went further. They made examples of women who couldn't be erased. Take Sister Angeline, who refused to deny her love for another woman even after being excommunicated. She was not burned. She was not executed. She was forgotten. Her name stripped from the abbey's records. Her writings lost in fire. Her body buried outside the cemetery wall, where no prayers were said. But centuries later, someone found a fragment of her journal behind a brick in the chapel wall. It read, "Erase my name, but not my truth. Burn the letters, but not the flame. God saw us, and that is enough." There were many like her, and the church knew. They saw the growing trail of emotional confessionals, of artistic symbols carved into pews, of sisters too attached to each other to pass as merely pious. They saw what they couldn't control. So they buried it, not with dirt, but with silence. They changed how convent histories were written. They trained priests to discern spiritual affection from carnal corruption. They censored memoirs. They instructed chroniclers to avoid details that could confuse the faithful. Entire decades of records are missing from certain convents. Why? Because those decades contained too much closeness. Too many shared initials. Too many rumors of mirrored rooms and shared ecstasies. And to the church, that was not history. That was heresy. But here's the thing about silence. It leaves shadows. And shadows lead us back to the light. Today, we piece together their stories not from official records, but from what's been smudged out. From half-written names. From inconsistent handwritings in hymnals. From gravestones whose inscriptions were scrubbed, but not replaced. We find them in court archives. In forgotten drawers of Vatican libraries. In marginalia scribbled in Latin that no longer obeys the rules. And every time we uncover another scrap, another phrase, another unburned corner of a love letter, we break the spell. We pull back the veil. And we hear their voices again. Some say the church was just trying to protect its purity. But whose purity? What were they really afraid of? Was it scandal? Or was it the quiet power of women who found joy without asking permission? Who loved without needing explanation? Who found God in each other's arms? That is the story they tried to erase. Not sin. Freedom. And that story is still dangerous. Because if it is true that women once built sacred love behind locked gates, then it is also true that love cannot be confined. Not by doctrine. Not by silence. Not by fear. So yes, they tried to erase it. But the stories are still here. In the sighs between stanzas. In the pauses of prayers. In the scars on the walls. Waiting to be read. Waiting to be remembered. Waiting for someone to say. They were here. They loved. They mattered. And they were never forgotten. For centuries, they were nothing but whispers. Erased lines in ledgers. Scrubbed names from tombstones. Ashes where letters once lived. And yet, something remained. Something that refused to stay buried. Today, across archives, graveyards, old chapels, and fragile manuscripts, a new generation of seekers, *** historians, queer scholars, archaeologists, and poets are listening, ***. And what they're hearing is the sound of love returning. It's not loud. Not yet. It comes in fragments. A page from a convent journal, spotted in an old monastery vault, contains a scribbled note between sisters. "You held my soul like it was yours," one wrote. No name, no date, but the handwriting is clear, the intimacy unmistakable. In a graveyard once covered in ivy, 2 stones lie next to each other, unmarked, but between them a ring was found, buried in the dirt, wrapped in linen. Matching hair strands woven into its knot. One blonde, one black. No inscription, but the message is clear. They were buried together. They were meant to be found, ***. In libraries long sealed, researchers are unbinding ancient texts, literally pulling apart pages to see the hidden palimpsests beneath. And there, beneath the formal Latin chants and liturgies, they're finding poems. Poems with language too intimate to be general. "My rib, my breath, my vow," one says. Another, "We were one candle. Now I flicker alone." These aren't hymns. They're confessions. And they're rebuilding a history that was never meant to survive. In a university in Spain, a scholar named Marta has spent 20 years retranslating censored convent manuscripts. She calls her project the Echoes of the Veiled. She doesn't rewrite the records. She reads between them. She's found patterns. In the way names vanish after certain entries. In the sudden shift in tone after confessions. In the odd use of metaphors, bride, flame, vessel, repeating like a heartbeat. She says, "These women were speaking. We just weren't taught to listen." Elsewhere, in Belgium, a team of archaeologists carefully excavates a 13th century convent. Beneath the altar, they find a crypt sealed with wax. Inside, 2 skeletons, buried in mirror pose, forehead to forehead, each one holding a small book of psalms. Carbon dating proves they were buried together, hidden together. There is no record of who they were. No church note. No local history. But someone sealed them there, *** intentionally. Carefully. Lovingly, ***. It was meant to be secret. It is now sacred. Every letter uncovered. Every stone unturned. Every altar floor lifted. Every choir book unglued. It's all part of a larger project. Reclaiming the voices of women the church tried to forget. And these scholars don't do it out of rebellion. They do it out of reverence. They are not inventing these stories. They are resurrecting them. And in doing so, they are restoring something far more valuable than data. They are restoring dignity. They are giving back names. Giving back love. Giving back truth. In a world still learning how to honor queer lives, these women, cloistered, silenced, erased, are now teachers. Not of theology, but of resilience. They show us how love survives centuries of shame. How longing endures through censorship. How grief writes itself into wood, into song, into hidden folds of old parchment. In one modern exhibit, visitors can see letters once thought to be meaningless scribbles. But under blacklight, scholars discovered they were layered, coated with lemon juice or mixed inks. Now they glow with invisible poems. "I will walk behind you in the halls," one says, "but ahead of you in dreams." Another, "We are not lost, only delayed." Across the globe, professors teach courses titled Queer Convents, Sisters in Silence, Saints of Desire. Students read Hildegard's letters not just as mystical visions, but as emotional blueprints for women who loved deeply in a world that denied them the right. The past is opening, not with scandal, but with reverence. And these stories don't just belong to scholars. They belong to all of us. They belong to the girl who never knew that women could love each other 1,000 years ago, to the man who thought he was alone in the silence of his desire, to the elders who see their long-forgotten truths now shining through medieval ink. They belong to anyone who has ever felt erased. They show us, you were not the first. You were never alone. And love, true love, leaves fingerprints on time. Asterisk, asterisk. Today's historians are not just digging through dust. They're digging through centuries of shame. And each time they find a letter, a grave, a hymn, a word, they light a candle where darkness was once enforced. They are not rewriting history. They are restoring it, letter by letter, grave by grave, name by sacred, silenced name. And in that restoration, the women who once whispered behind locked convent doors are finally being heard. Some say these stories are curiosities, whispers from a forgotten time, footnotes in history books, soft scandals to be tucked away under the dust of doctrine. But that's not what they are. They are sacred, because anything that survives erasure, anything that lives through silence, anything that dares to love in the face of punishment, that is not a footnote. That is scripture in its rawest form. These women, nuns, mystics, companions, lovers, were not rebels for the sake of rebellion. They were survivors, creators, believers, and they carved entire worlds of love into the smallest spaces imaginable. A shared bench in a chapel, a glance across candlelight, a psalm line altered by a single word, a grave dug just a little closer to the one who made life worth enduring. Their love was not loud, but it was unbreakable. When the church said their bodies belonged to God, they gave them to each other anyway. When men claimed their voices, they rewrote prayers in the margins. When medicine declared them sick, they feigned symptoms just to stay close. When theology condemned them, they found a theology of their own, in laughter, in touch, in devotion. Their resistance was not in revolt. It was in routine, asterisk, asterisk, washing each other's feet with tenderness, tending to one another in sickness when no one else would, praying not to each other, but through each other. And that is survival. That is love at its bravest. Not when it's celebrated, but when it must hide and refuses to die. The world called them sinners. The church called them confused. History tried to call them nothing at all. But we know better now. We know what it takes to live in love under threat. We know how sacred a vow becomes when spoken in code. We know the weight of a touch when it could be your last. These women invented new languages of longing. They turned silence into signal, prayer into poetry, proximity into permanence. They were not waiting for liberation. They were creating it in the smallest, most faithful ways. And what they made has outlived them. It lives in us. In the way queer people still code their love today. In the way some still pray differently, silently, holding truths no one else knows. In the way two hands held in defiance still feels like an ancient blessing. Their legacy isn't in tragedy. It's in craft. They crafted survival. They crafted care in the face of cruelty. They crafted eternity out of stolen moments. And the proof is still here. In graves without names, where love is buried side by side. In songs that never made it into the canon but were sung, heart to heart. In letters written in ink mixed with tears, passed hand to trembling hand. These were not fleeting feelings. These were lifelong devotions. Women who chose each other. Not for lust, not for rebellion, but for companionship in a world that offered none. And now their stories rise. Not because the church allowed it, but because truth refuses to rot. Because memory, once awakened, cannot be put back to sleep. So let us stop calling them footnotes. They're foundations. The roots beneath today's freedom. The echoes behind today's whispers. The ones who walked so we might kiss without apology. Write without code. Love without fear. Let their names return. Let their symbols be read. Let their silences finally sing. Because what they did was holy. And what they left behind is ours.